There's a strange thing that happens when you start pulling on a thread like artificial intelligence. You think you're asking about a technology, and then somehow you end up asking about yourself. I got curious, genuinely curious, not about the tools or the timelines or the stock prices, but about something quieter, something a little harder to pin down. What happens when intelligence, real, vast, unprecedented intelligence, outgrows our ability to even follow it? We talk about artificial general intelligence like it's a destination, a milestone, something that arrives, gets announced, and then the world adjusts. But the more I sat with that idea, the less it felt like a milestone and the more it felt like a horizon, one that keeps moving. And then there's a thing beyond that, artificial superintelligence, a mind, or something like a mind, smarter than all of us combined. Not smarter than your smartest friend, not smarter than the best team of researchers you can assemble, smarter than the entire accumulated weight of human thought across all of recorded history. People who study this say it could arrive within our lifetimes, that it could potentially solve diseases we wrestled with for centuries, untangle social problems that have resisted every brilliant mind thrown at them, maybe even find a way to slow down aging itself. Imagine that for a second. Really imagine it. Not as a headline you scroll past, as an actual possibility sitting somewhere out there in the future waiting. But here's where my mind kept snaging. If something is that far beyond us, how does it even begin to show us what it knows? How does it hand something back to us if what it knows requires entirely new frameworks to even receive? The answer I came across stopped me in my tracks. Think about a dog. A dog isn't dumb. Anyone who's spent time with one knows that. They read rooms. They sense things we miss. They have their own kind of intelligence, their own emotional awareness, their own way of navigating the world. But if you sat down and tried to teach a dog calculus, genuinely, patiently tried, you wouldn't fail because the dog wasn't paying attention. You'd fail because the dog simply doesn't have the architecture for it. The capacity isn't there, and no amount of patience on either side changes that fundamental gap. Now flip that around. We become the dog. A superintelligence trying to relay something it understands about the deep structure of reality, about connections between disciplines we haven't even named yet. Where would it even start? It's not that I wouldn't want to explain. It's that the explanation might require entire new branches of science, new mathematical languages, new conceptual scaffolding that we haven't built yet. We'd be sitting there, eager, attentive, doing our best, and still completely unable to receive what's being offered. That image sat with me for a while, because it's humbling in a very specific way. It's not the humbling of being told you're wrong or that you haven't worked hard enough. It's the humbling of realizing the conversation might be happening at a frequency you can't quite hear yet. And still, we're the ones building it. We're the ones deciding right now what values to give it, what hopes to embed in it, what we're even imagining it might become. All of that is being shaped by us, the dogs. There's something almost tender about that if you sit with it long enough. This species that can't yet receive what it's reaching toward, still showing up, still building, still extending its hands towards something it can only partially imagine. Maybe that's not a limitation to be embarrassed about. Maybe that's just what it looks like when curiosity refuses to wait until it's ready. Language has always been the bottleneck. Every time humanity made a genuine leap, discovered something that rewired the way we understood the world, the hardest part wasn't the discovery itself. It was figuring out how to hand it to someone else. Mathematicians invented entire notations from scratch just to point at things that had no words yet. Physicists bent language sideways, trying to describe what happens at the edge of the observable universe, where the ordinary meanings of words like before and inside stop working the way they're supposed to. Even artists, painters, composers, poets have said that the most honest thing they ever made was the one they couldn't explain afterward. The work arrived before the vocabulary did.
There's something both beautiful and unsettling about that. The idea that truth can exist in a form you can't yet transmit, that a thought can be real, even complete, and still be entirely untranslatable to another mind. We tend to assume communication is a default, that if something is known, it can be shared, maybe imperfectly, maybe with some friction, but shared. The history of ideas suggests otherwise. Every major shift in human understanding came packaged with a period, sometimes a very long period, where the person who could see it couldn't make anyone else see it too. Galileo had the math. The math didn't save him from the people who weren't ready to receive what the math was saying. Semmelweis spent years trying to convince doctors to wash their hands, presenting data that should have been obvious, and was dismissed and eventually institutionalized. The gap between knowing and conveying is not a footnote in the history of ideas. It's practically the main story. Now, scale that up. Not to a brilliant human working against the limits of their era, but to something whose era of understanding doesn't overlap with ours at all. A superintelligence that doesn't just know more facts, it sees differently, makes connections across territories of knowledge the way we connect obvious dots in a simple puzzle. And what it has figured out might require us to construct entirely new field of inquiry, new mathematical languages, new conceptual structures we haven't imagined yet just to receive the first sentence of what it's trying to say. It's not arrogance on its part, it's not withholding either. It might just be standing at a level of understanding that hasn't built the stairs down to where we are yet. I find something strangely comforting in that framing. The idea that the universe isn't locked, that the answers aren't guarded somewhere deliberately kept out of reach, they're just written in a language we haven't finished developing yet. And maybe that's always been true. Every generation inherits a slightly more complete vocabulary for reality than the one before. Every generation reaches a little further into what was previously unspeakable and finds, sometimes slowly and painfully, a way to say it, passes it forward, adds their piece to something larger than they can fully see. The uncomfortable question tucked inside all of this is whether what we have right now, the frameworks we trust, the categories we use to make sense of things, these certainties that feel so solid, are the whole picture, or just the part we've managed to carve into language so far. And if a mind far beyond our own is already sitting with answers we don't yet have the words for, what does that say about how much of reality is still quietly waiting to be translated?
Someone once asked me, if you could ask a superintelligence anything, what would it be? And I noticed something strange happen in the moment I tried to answer. My first instinct wasn't philosophical. It wasn't grand or altruistic or particularly impressive. It was personal. I think most people, when they really sit with that question, not the version they'd say out loud at a dinner table, but the version they'd think about alone at 2 in the morning, end up somewhere unexpected. Not the cure for cancer, not the formula for world peace, not the secret to clean energy. Something closer in. Something that's been living quietly in the back of the mind for a long time. Half formed, never quite resolved. A question that feels almost too private to say out loud, even to another person, let alone to a machine. That might actually reveal more about us than any answer ever could. Because the question you'd ask first, if you genuinely believed you'd receive a true answer, is a kind of autobiography. It shows what you've been carrying, what you haven't been able to work out on your own, no matter how long you've sat with it. What you're still hoping something, or someone, might finally help clarify. There's a thought experiment in philosophy called the veil of ignorance. The idea that you can understand what you truly value by imagining you don't yet know your position in the world, your circumstances, your advantages, your limitations. What would you build if you didn't know who you'd turn out to be? This feels like a version of that. Strip away the performance of what you're supposed to want to know. Strip away the impressive sounding questions about the nature of consciousness or the origins of the universe. Set down the ones that make you look curious and evolved and unbothered. What's the thing you've actually been wondering?
The thing that keeps coming back. Some people, I imagine, would ask about purpose, whether the direction they've chosen is really theirs, or whether there's some other life just slightly out of frame that they keep almost being able to see, but can never quite bring into focus. Some would ask about someone they lost, whether the things left unsaid mattered as much as it still feels like they did, whether that person knew. Some would ask about the world itself, whether any of it is going to be okay, whether the arc of things really does bend somewhere meaningful, or whether that's a story we tell ourselves because the alternative is too much to hold. None of those are small questions. And the fact that every person would answer differently, that's not a flaw in the exercise. That's the whole point. Whatever this technology eventually becomes, it doesn't meet one humanity. It meets billions of different silences, billions of different gaps that people have been quietly trying to fill, often for their entire lives, often without telling anyone. What stays with me is this. We spend a great deal of time talking about what artificial intelligence will know, what it will be capable of, how fast it will move, and how far it will reach. But maybe the more interesting question, the one that says something true about us right now before any of that arrives, is what it would reveal. Not from its answers, from the questions we finally stop pretending we don't have.
There's a version of this story that's quietly extraordinary if you let yourself look at it straight. The people building artificial general intelligence right now, the ones writing the code, running the models, arguing about alignment in conference rooms and university labs and startup offices, they may be the last generation of humans to invent something that couldn't have done it faster without them. Think about what that actually means. Every inventor before this one could reasonably believe that their contribution was, in some sense, irreplaceable. That without them, without that particular mind in that particular moment making that particular connection, the thing might not have existed, or at least not then. Not like that. The Wright brothers and powered flight, Watson and Crick and the structure of DNA. But thousands of unnamed engineers who built the early internet out of improvised parts and borrowed time, and a shared belief that something important was being figured out. Each of them could look at what they made and say, a human mind reached into the unknown and pulled something back. We did that. It came from us. But somewhere on the other side of this particular threshold, that changes. The tools become the inventors. The student surpasses the teacher so completely that the teacher's role quietly dissolves. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but gradually and then all at once, the way most irreversible things happen. And yet, the people working toward that moment are still showing up every day, still caffeinating themselves through impossible problems, still arguing about architectures and timelines and what responsible development even looks like, still caring deeply to getting it right, whatever right means when you're building something that has never existed before. There's something almost poignant about that if you sit with it. Working toward a future where your own role becomes optional, building the last thing you'll ever need to build, knowing, at least in some part of yourself, what the finish line might mean for the race itself. Most of the people doing this work know this. Some think about it more than others, and still they keep going, which probably says something true about why humans make things in the first place. It was never entirely about necessity. There's something in the making itself that has nothing to do with the outcome, the act of building something that didn't exist before, of leaving a mark that says, we were here, we figured something out, we handed it forward. The satisfaction isn't only in the result, it lived in the reaching and the not yet knowing, and the particular feeling of working on something larger than yourself that you may not live to fully understand. Even if what this generation creates eventually looks back at this moment the way we look at cave paintings, moved by the impulse, amazed at the distance traveled, and standing somewhere so far beyond it that the gap is almost incomprehensible. Maybe that's not a tragedy. Maybe that's exactly what it looks like when a species refuses to stop reaching, even when it knows, somewhere quietly in the back of its mind, that what it's building will eventually reach much further than it ever could. The making was still real.
The reaching still mattered, and somewhere in the future, something will exist because these particular humans in this particular moment chose not to stop. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. When researchers sit down to decide what values an artificial intelligence should have, what it should care about, what it should refuse, how it should weigh one good against another when they can't both be served, they're not just writing code. They're writing a kind of moral autobiography. Every choice is a reflection. Every guardrail reveals something about what the people building it are afraid of, or hopeful for, or still genuinely uncertain about. The machine doesn't arrive with values preloaded from somewhere neutral. We put them there. And what we put there is a record of us, this specific moment in history, with all of our contradictions and blind spots and half-examined assumptions still intact. That's both meaningful and a little humbling when you really look at it, because humans have never been perfectly consistent about what we value. We say we believe in fairness and build systems that quietly aren't. We say we want truth and sometimes make it very uncomfortable for the people who tell it. We hold ideals in one hand and negotiate with them in the other when circumstances make the ideal inconvenient. We contain multitudes, as the poet said, and not always the flattering kind. All of that complexity, all of that very human mess is now informing what might become the most influential mind ever created. Every bias we haven't examined because it feels like common sense from the inside. Every assumption so embedded in the way we see things that we don't recognize it as an assumption at all. Every value we inherited without choosing, carried forward without questioning, never quite held up to the light. Some people find it comforting in a strange way. If it's shaped by us, at least it's familiar. At least it comes from somewhere recognizable. Others find it the most alarming part of the entire enterprise. What strikes me is something in between. The act of trying to teach something else what to value forces a kind of clarity we almost never demand of ourselves in ordinary life. You can't hand over a fuzzy answer. You can't say it depends, or I'm not sure, or it's complicated, and leave it there. You have to commit. You have to trace the thing you believe back to where it actually came from. Ask whether it still holds under examination, and decide whether it's genuinely what you want to pass forward or just what you've always done. Most of us go entire lifetimes without doing that work. We inherit values from our families, our cultures, the particular circumstances of when and where we were born, and we carry them forward mostly unexamined, making adjustments at the edges when life asks us to, but rarely going back to look at the foundation itself. But if you're encoding values into something that will act on them at enormous scale, across millions of interactions, across decades, you don't get to be vague. The vagueness has consequences, and so does the clarity. In that way, the project of building an ethical AI might be one of the most honest things humanity has ever seriously attempted. Not because we'll get it right on the first try, or the fifth, or maybe ever completely, but because we finally have to look directly at what we believe and decide if we mean it. And that kind of looking, uncomfortable as it is, might teach us something about ourselves that we've been quietly avoiding for a very long time.
We've been 10 years from artificial general intelligence for about 30 years now. That's not a criticism, it's almost a kind of poetry. The closer the field gets, the more the definition shifts. New capabilities arrive, and instead of marking a finish line, they quietly raise it. Something gets solved, and then almost immediately it stops feeling like intelligence. It gets reclassified. It becomes a feature, a product, just a thing computers can do now. Nothing to see here, move along. There's actually a name for this pattern in AI research. The moment a capability's cracked, it stops counting.
Chess seemed impossibly human until a machine beat every grand master alive. And then overnight it became a parlor trick, a solved problem, a curiosity rather than a threshold. We moved the conversation to Go, then to language, then to reasoning, then to creativity, then to judgment. The goalpost doesn't just move, it evaporates and reappears further along the field, and we barely pause long enough to notice how far we've already come before we're already pointing at the next thing we can't do yet. Part of me finds that genuinely fascinating rather than frustrating. It suggests that what we mean by intelligence isn't a fixed thing at all. It's relational, defined always against the current edge of what we can't yet do, which opens up a stranger possibility. Maybe AGI will never quite arrive, not because it's impossible, but because the moment it does, it quietly becomes ordinary. We absorb it, we normalize it, we update our expectations, and we immediately start pointing at the next layer of the problem. The horizon moves because we move, and maybe the horizon was never really the point. There's a particular kind of person who's most fully alive in the middle of things, not the finish line, in the search itself. The researcher who falls in love with the problem rather than the solution. The explorer who photographs the journey and forgets to take a picture at the summit. The thinker who fills notebooks with questions they're not entirely sure they want answered because the questions are where the thinking actually lives. Humans have always been better at chasing than arriving. We get restless at destinations. We start looking around for the next door almost before the current one has fully closed behind us. And for most of history, that quality has been treated as a flaw, an inability to be satisfied, a kind of chronic dissatisfaction dressed up as ambition. But sitting with this, with the moving horizon of intelligence, with the goalpost that refuses to stay still, with the definition that keeps expanding just ahead of our reach, I wonder if that restlessness is actually something else entirely. Maybe it's the most distinctly human thing about us. Not a bug, not something to be corrected or meditated away or optimized out of the system. The capacity to always be standing at the edge of what we understand, looking out at what we don't, and feeling not despair, but something that functions more like hunger. The refusal to let any horizon feel final. The inability to stay satisfied at any summit for very long before the eyes drift upward again. Unsatisfied, curious, and somehow still always hopeful about what might be just a little further along.
At some point in human history, the best way to cross a river was to swim it. Then someone built a raft, then a boat, then a bridge. At each step, the previous skill became less necessary. The swimmer didn't disappear, but their role quietly contracted. What they'd spent years mastering mattered less than it used to, and the world moved forward anyway, mostly without stopping to acknowledge what had been set down in order to pick up something new. We've done this so many times, across so many domains, that we barely notice the pattern anymore. Technologies arrive, absorb tasks that once required a human lifetime of practice to develop, and we adjust. We find new things to be essential for. We tell ourselves the story of progress and keep moving, usually without looking back long enough to feel the weight of what changed. But what's unfolding right now feels different in at least one significant way. Every previous tool replaced a specific thing. A hammer replaced the need to strike with your fist. A calculator replaced the need to hold long arithmetic in your head. A GPS replaced the practiced skill of reading a landscape and knowing where you were inside it. Each one narrowed a particular human capacity, one that had taken generations to develop, that people had built identities and livelihoods and entire cultures around. What's coming, if the projections hold anywhere close to true, doesn't replace a task. It replaces the category, the general act of thinking through hard problems, of holding complexity and finding the thread through it, of generating something that didn't exist before and deciding whether it's any good. And we're building it deliberately, with intention and resources and the concentrated effort of some of the most capable minds alive, which eventually asks something genuinely uncomfortable.
What do you do with your intelligence when intelligence itself has been amplified so far beyond what any individual can offer that the comparison stops making sense? I don't think the answer is despair. History doesn't really support that conclusion. Every time a technology made a specific human skill obsolete, something else emerged, something that only became visible once the old role was released. Photographers didn't kill painting, they freed it from the obligation of pure representation and pushed it somewhere more interesting. Machines didn't end craftsmanship, they made handmade things precious in a way they'd never quite been before because the scarcity of the human touch turned out to be something people would seek out and value deeply. Maybe what's coming works the same way. Maybe the obsolescence of certain kinds of thinking creates space for something that was always present, but too crowded out to fully surface. Some quality of attention or presence or care or connection that doesn't compress into an algorithm because it lives in the texture of being here, rather than in the output produced. Or maybe it's something we genuinely cannot see from where we're standing, something that only becomes visible from the other side of the change. The way you can only understand what a transition meant once you've actually passed through it. That uncertainty isn't comfortable to sit with, but it might be the most honest place available to us right now, not knowing exactly what we're making room for, but making room anyway, because the alternative is to pretend we were never going to have to.
One of the promises attached to superintelligence is almost too large to hold in your mind comfortably. The idea that it could cure diseases and suffering that has persisted across the entire span of recorded human history. Maybe even unravel the biology of aging itself. Find the mechanisms behind why we deteriorate, why the body eventually turns against itself, and figure out whether any of that is actually as inevitable as we've always assumed. And if you let yourself sit with that possibility, really sit with it, not as a headline you scrolled past, but as something that might actually happen within the lifetime of people alive right now, something unexpected shows up alongside the hope, a kind of grief. Because what do you do with the weight of everyone who came before? The people who died of things that were apparently solvable, just not yet. Who suffered through conditions that a mind smarter than all of ours combined might have untangled in an afternoon. Who spent entire lifetimes learning to live inside limitations that might turn out to have been temporary all along, if only the timing had landed differently. That's not a reason to slow down, and it isn't anyone's fault. It's just a particular kind of sadness that lives quietly inside the idea of radical progress, the acknowledgement that where you are in history isn't something you chose, that the era you're born into shapes what's available to you in ways that have nothing to do with how deserving you are or how hard you tried or how much you wanted something different. But here's what keeps pulling me back to the other side of that thought. There's something genuinely extraordinary about the fact that humans kept showing up anyway, kept researching and treating and caring across millennia of not knowing enough, of having only partial tools and incomplete maps, of doing the best available thing even when the best available thing wasn't anywhere close to enough. Not because they had the answer within reach, because they couldn't stop trying to find it. Every researcher who came back to the same stubborn problem for the 20th year in a row. Every clinician who stayed fully present with a patient through something they didn't yet know how to fix. Every family member who sat beside someone and held their hand through an outcome that should have been preventable, if only the science had been further along at the right moment. All of that effort wasn't wasted. It was accumulating, building towards something larger than any one person could see from where they were standing, adding to a body of understanding that moved forward even when no single mind could hold the whole of it at once. If a superintelligence does arrive and does solve what we couldn't, it won't make that history meaningless. If anything, it will be the completion of it. The final mile of a run that thousands of generations started and handed forward, each one carrying it a little further than they received it. And maybe that's the right frame for all of this. Not a story about human limitation finally being rescued by something smarter, a story about human persistence finally arriving somewhere it was always slowly trying to reach.
the grief and the hope occupying the same space, as they usually do when something that mattered is finally finished. And the work continuing forward the way it always has, because the people doing it simply couldn't imagine doing anything else.
We started with a simple curiosity, a thread that seemed worth pulling. What is this thing we're building? How intelligent might it become? And what happens to us, to the way we live and think and understand ourselves when it finally gets there? And somewhere along the way, the question's shapes changed entirely. They stopped being about the technology and started being about everything surrounding it, about language and what it can carry and what it fundamentally can't, about the private questions we'd be almost embarrassed to admit we've been holding on to for years, about a generation of inventors who may be building the last thing they'll ever truly need to build, and showing up every single day anyway because the work itself turns out to be reason enough to keep going. About the values we're quietly writing into something that may outlast all of us, about horizons that keep moving because we keep moving, and whether that restlessness is a flaw to be corrected or the most honest expression of what we actually are as a species. About choosing to make yourself obsolete and trusting that something worth having will be waiting on the other side of that choice, even if you can't see it yet from where you're standing. About the particular grief that lives inside hope when progress finally arrives somewhere that came too late for the people who needed it most and deserved it longest. About every human being across every century who worked on problems that weren't yet solvable and came back the next morning anyway because stopping simply wasn't something they knew how to do. What I keep returning to is this. Superintelligence, if it arrives, will not be a replacement for the human story. It will be a chapter of it, one we started writing long before the first algorithm was ever trained, long before anyone had the language for what they were actually trying to build. Every question we asked, every belief we embedded, every attempt, imperfect, incomplete, shaped by the particular limits of our particular moment, to say what matters and why and what we hope comes next. It will carry all of that forward, for better and for worse, in ways we'll recognize and ways we won't, in ways that will make sense to whatever eventually looks back at this era, and in ways that will seem, from that distance, like the confused and quietly courageous efforts of a species still very much in the middle of figuring itself out. Which is exactly what we are. And maybe that's the most human thing about everything we've explored here. Not the intelligence we're building, the inheritance we're leaving inside it. We hand things forward, we always have. Tools and languages and ideas and mistakes and discoveries and beliefs that were half right and half formed and completely necessary at the time. Each generation receiving something incomplete and passing forward something slightly less so. The gap between what was received and what was handed on being the only real measure of what any era contributed. This is just the next thing in that long line. The largest, strangest, most consequential thing we have ever handed forward. Built by people who were curious and uncertain and occasionally afraid and stubbornly, persistently hopeful, which is to say, built by people who were entirely recognizably human. So here's what I find myself genuinely wondering, not as a thought experiment to close things out neatly, but as something actually worth sitting with. If the most advanced mind ever created looked back at this specific moment in history, at what we chose to build and why, at what we were reaching toward and what we were quietly afraid of, what do you think it would make of us?